I expect many anti-furries will respond to this with cap, womp womp, ain't hearing all that, cope, and all the other dumb comments that demonstrate you're not intelligent enough to understand what's being discussed in this video. It also demonstrates a crude emotional insulator. Having the constant need to be overly defensive indicates the subject matter hits home. I don't particularly care. Enjoy the consequences that come from self-conflict, keeping in mind they are only going to get worse with time. I find you all to make for an interesting real-world case study, and so here we go. Sigmund Freud is considered the father of psychoanalysis, a field of research that helps us understand the complexity of the unconscious mind and how it impacts pretty much everything. He developed a list of defensive mechanisms, and this work was expounded upon by his daughter, Anna Freud, who is the founder of child psychoanalytic psychology. The realm of the unconscious is vast, and today we're going to look at how this fits with anti-furries, who are essentially furries in denial, at least to varying degrees. Three terms that are important to note real quick. The id, the base urges wired into every human brain, animalistic in nature. The superego, how we measure ourselves against societal norms, a form of conscience essentially. The ego, the regulator that serves to keep the id in check and moderates between the two. Typically, the id contains emotional impulses and desires, particularly libido and aggression, but it can also represent any desire not considered socially acceptable. This is a key point to consider in the realm of so-called anti-furries. Well, for some, they in all likelihood have a suppressed libidinous urge towards furries. For others, it may be a simple curiosity or attraction, based on a host of other factors. Anti-furries can range in age from children to seniors, and exposure to the furry fandom can range from casual internet observer to being a furry themselves, closeted or otherwise. When it comes to the psychoanalytic theory of the defense mechanism, however, these distinctions don't matter. At best, they would only affect how the defense is manifested. And for anti-furries, their apparent fixation on, fear of, and hatred for all things furry manifests as neurosis. Except in reality, they themselves are furries. And here's how. The definition of a furry can be broad, but essentially it is a person who has an appreciation for anthropomorphic animals. Now keep in mind, these ego defense mechanisms originate from the unconscious to shield one from anxiety, shame, or the demands of the id and superego. Reaction formation, originally identified by Freud, would later be classified as a level 3 or neurotic defense by psychiatrist George Eamon Valiant. Valiant characterization placed the defense mechanisms on a scale as applied to mental health. So, reaction formation places more stable than level 1, which includes psychotic denial and delusions. Level 4 contains the most mature defense mechanisms. But what is reaction formation? It's when a person goes beyond denial and behaves in the opposite way to which he or she thinks or feels. Conscious behaviors are adopted to overcompensate for the anxiety a person feels regarding their socially unacceptable unconscious thoughts or emotions. Usually, a reaction formation is marked by exaggerated behavior, such as showiness and compulsiveness. By using the reaction formation, the id is satisfied while keeping the ego in ignorance of the true motives. One example identified by Freud is when men who are prejudiced against homosexuals are making a defense against their own homosexual feelings by adopting a harsh anti-homosexual attitude which helps convince them of their heterosexuality. Or another example would be someone who has an attraction to furry and either because of peer pressure, preconceived social norms, or other regulators is fearful to indulge in this interest, so they convert it into a consuming and disproportionately hysterical rage, lashing out against that which they find fascinating. Another defense is displacement, also a neurotic defense on the valence scale. Here, the mind substitutes a new object for things felt in their original form to be dangerous or unacceptable. Displacement occurs when the id wants to do something which the superego does not permit. The ego thus finds some other way of releasing the psychic energy of the id. Thus, there is a transfer of energy from a repressed object, catharsis, to a more acceptable object. And a catharsis is the investment of mental or emotional energy in a person, object, or idea. So basically, appreciation of furries becomes a rational burning hatred of them. Turning against the self is a very special form of displacement, where the person becomes their own substitute target. It is normally used in reference to hatred, anger, and aggression, rather than more positive impulses, and it is the Freudian explanation for many of our feelings of inferiority, guilt, and depression. The idea that depression is often the result of the anger we refuse to acknowledge is widely accepted. An example could be internalized homophobia, like the mega-church pastors who persecute gays, and then it comes out that they themselves are gay. I think you can see how this applies to anti-furries. Repression is an unconscious defense mechanism employed by the ego to keep disturbing or threatening thoughts from becoming conscious. Repression, which Anna Freud also called motivated forgetting, is not a very successful defense in the long term, since it involves forcing disturbing wishes and ideas into the unconscious, where, although hidden, they will create anxiety. Repressed desires may also appear through subconscious means and in altered forms, such as dreams or slips of the tongue, which are Freudian slips or parapraxis. Projection is a psychological defense mechanism in which an individual attributes unwanted thoughts, feelings, and motives onto another person. Valent categorizes this as an immature defense, or a level 1 pathological if delusions are present. Projection, which Anna Freud also called displacement outward, is almost the complete opposite of turning against the self. It involves the tendency to see your own unacceptable desires in other people. In other words, the desires are still there, but they're not your desires anymore. Thoughts most commonly projected onto another are the ones that would cause guilt, such as aggressive and sexual fantasies or thoughts. A bully may project their own feelings of vulnerability onto their target, or an anti-furry projects their unreconciled and, as such, unhealthy fixation of anthropomorphic characters onto the furry fandom. In other words, the anti-furry projects their own mentally unbalanced obsession onto the community as a whole. Sublimation is the process of deflecting sexual instincts into acts of higher social valuation. This meaning can be expanded to other emotional redirections, including anger. It is therefore usually a positive, but the Freudian Wolfman case study shows sublimation can result in mania and chaos. In that case, a young boy's sexual attraction to his father was redirected towards Christianity, and eventually led the boy to obsessional neurosis in the form of uncontrollable sacrilegious reverence. And since so many of you seem to love this word, how is any of this like the ability to cope? The process of coping involves using logic and ration to stabilize negative emotions and stressors. This differs from defense, which is driven by impulse and urges. So, there you have it. Anti-furries' denial of self places them in an endless cycle of frustration and internal conflict.